Hello, it's me again, Midnight Shadows. Today, let's dive into a tale shrouded in mystery and horror. Years ago, when I was still a teenager, my friend Justin and I would often go longboarding at night. We were night owls, drawn to the freedom of rarely encountering another soul on the roads or paths we frequented. Even on main roads, it was still rare to see a car so late in a rural area, and we could see and hear them coming from far away, their headlights and engine noise shattering the peaceful silence of the night. It was an experience we were truly captivated by. It began with a narrow, paved pathway that was the only piece of land separating two sides of a long lake. It would often sink under due to rain, and we wanted to seize the opportunity to use it before it rained and went underwater again. It was roughly 2 miles long. Because of the scenery, it was very relaxing to drive through. After making it to the end, we decided to continue moving and turned into a nearby path that leads directly into a densely wooded wilderness preservation. As we came up the first hill, we looked down at the bottom into the blackness. We both noticed what appeared to be a tiny, moving ball of dim light down there. It moved strangely, and it was extremely difficult to make out what it was. Rather than shine our flashlights down, we curiously watched it for a few moments, whispering to each other about what it could possibly be. All at once, that small beam turned into multiple blinding lights, overwhelming our senses that had become accustomed to the dark and silence. Acting purely on fear, we instantly turned around and ran as fast as we could, hearing yelling and revving gaining behind us. By sheer luck, we managed to run off-path into a very dark, overgrown hole in the side of the hill, overlooking where we had just come from. We then decided to hide out in the natural dugout of this hill, hoping the plants and darkness would be enough to protect us from whatever was happening out there. We watched our pursuers right up to where we had originally been standing. There were 4 men, 2 on four-wheelers, and 2 on full-sized motorcycles. They were yelling at each other about something, but we couldn't make out what they were saying due to the distance we had covered. They felt safe enough to whisper very softly to each other and speculated about who these people could be. Our first thought was that they might be park rangers of some kind, although we had never seen one out here in the many times that we had been through. And honestly, we doubted this county even had the budget or desire to have anyone patrol so deep in the woods at night. Besides that, these men were on vehicles entirely inappropriate for the paved bike trails, and they were very angry about something. They called out to us for a while, yelling things like, "We know you're out here. We can see you. Come on out." We stayed very silent and decided to call their bluff instead of running. Eventually, we clearly heard one of them yell, "Find them now," then smashed a bottle. That erased any hope we had that these were just park rangers. We watched them split up, each of them going a different way down the series of paths on their vehicles, including the path we came from. It took us what felt like ages to even move. We were frozen in terror inside that dugout, watching the lights in the vehicles travel through the woods and pathways, one of them already coming full circle and passing the point he started from. I thought about calling for help, but I was too afraid to even open my phone, in fear that even the smallest amount of light would give away our location. After waiting for the lights of the vehicles to reach their furthest distance, we finally summoned the nerve to get up and try to run far enough away from these people to safely make a call. We ran as fast as we could through the woods. Since the headlights gave away their location on the pathways, we would hide again whenever we thought they were getting too close. The available hiding spots were getting progressively worse as the forest became less dense. The fear I felt while I waited for one of them to drive past us, and only being covered by leaves and plants, may still be unmatched to this day. Finally, we emerged from the forest onto the intersection of two main roads, far from where we started. We ducked down into a ditch to call for help. When I opened my phone, I noticed I had recent missed calls from one of our other friends, named Connor, who we were supposed to meet up with after our excursion. I called him and frantically asked where he was. Luck was with us again. He hadn't given up on our plans despite us ignoring him, and was only a few miles away from where we were, already heading in our direction. I gave him the names of two streets we were near the corner of, and explained that we had to be picked up right away. He agreed and sped over to us, while Justin and I waited in hiding. Thankfully, Connor arrived before any of those men did. We bolted into the back seat of his car, yelling for him to get out of there, and he took off. Relief doesn't begin to describe what I felt being safely driven home. After explaining everything that happened to Connor, we ended up just moving on with our night, and decided not to call the police. We figured they would be gone by the time any officer made it out there anyway. And we would only be putting ourselves at risk as well, by admitting to breaking the law by being on those trails so late at night. I still have no idea who those people were. I have been told all kinds of theories from friends and family who have heard this story. Some think we interrupted a huge drug deal. Justin and I admitted to each other that when the revving started, and we couldn't see, our minds both went straight to chainsaw-wielding a horror movie serial killer. So I suppose it could have been much worse. Frustratingly enough, whatever those men thought we saw that made them want to catch us so badly, we never actually saw. So I suppose we'll never really know. My friend suggested I share my story on here, and I finally found the time to type it out. I'm not sure if this would exactly meet the standards of this outlet, but it's definitely the scariest experience I've ever had. So here it goes. At the time, I was only 10 years old, and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that is littered in large forests. Almost every house there had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which by itself was very scenic. I'm 21 now, and I live in a bustling city in Alberta. I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while, but it's usually accompanied by the very unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in 4th grade, I was already trusted to be home by myself whenever my mother went out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who lived only a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy about the arrangement. I was an only child, and my father would be gone for work months at a time, so to me I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late movie nights and video gaming. Every once in a while I would explore the aforementioned forest, and on the night in question, that's what I was doing. I usually never went too far in. There was this rock formation I liked to climb, and once I got to the top I would look out in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. It felt like my own private little world that I could enjoy. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit at my usual spot, I suddenly began hearing a sound from further in. It wasn't a natural sound at all. It was very faint. It sounded like someone crying. I was more puzzled than scared, since crying was the last thing I would ever expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a few minutes, convinced that my ears were playing tricks on me. But it was not an auditory hallucination. There was someone, in fact, crying. Es voelde zon terug. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest and got lost. I considered going back to the house and calling my mom for help, but then I was worried that the girl would wander further in and go beyond earshot. I decided to try and locate her myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction the crying was coming from. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought. It was a matter of trial and error, just to make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing that never occurred to me in the moment was how consistent this crying was. There were no pauses, no words of any kind, just a non-stop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was that the closer I got, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached a small clearing that only had a few trees and bushes. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. It was a gray tape recorder, one of the biggest I've ever seen. It was protruding out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speaker. This was very disturbing to me. I was expecting to find a real person. As I was about to turn it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady footsteps advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying the rocks and trees as landmarks. This probably saved my life. I never looked back, and I didn't even try listening to hear if that person was following me. I just kept telling myself that I had to make it home. Nothing else mattered. I just had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation I liked to climb, it didn't take long for me to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time, and I immediately ran into my house, locking the door and shutting all the lights off as I went into my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peered out through them as discreetly as I could to see if whoever was out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by that window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge from the forest, but nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed, and I also was never able to go back into that forest ever again. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm a USAF Security Forces airman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a sweltering hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick and I decided to go explore some back roads. He is also in the military. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with long roads, some actively used, but many are totally forgotten and sit in a state of disrepair. Nick and I spent many of our days starting on roads that we knew and looking for roads that we didn't know, driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to the paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds looming over the mountains, we set off on a road that we had never been on and began the drive. On this particular day, there were storm clouds looming over the mountains. After traveling for about an hour, We hadn't seen or heard any signs of other people in the area. We rounded a bend inside the thick woods and emerged at a meadow that was totally surrounded by aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat. Both Nick and I noticed a strange stillness in the air almost immediately. There were no birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of this meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a wooden picnic table. The table was very odd. It was painted a bright orange. It was much larger than your typical picnic table at a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen groves was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as aspens tend to grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not a very tall man. I only stand around 5'5". Regardless, this table was ridiculously oversized, practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to sit on them. As I was inspecting the table, Nick called me over to the truck. I noticed he was looking back into the trees. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of color that was completely out of place in the trees. It was a small, one-man tent, about 50 feet from the strange table. Initially, I had a feeling of dread, and I felt certain that there was somebody in that tent. And if we could see that tent from where we were, they could definitely see us. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, and no main road for miles. Surely somebody camping so remotely would be, at the very least, a strange individual. However, as we observed the tent, we saw no movement and heard no sounds coming from it. Nick suggested that I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. Hey, anyone in there? No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area. But we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in that tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? It's highly unlikely, I know, but the thought did occur to us all the same. After some back and forth, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around, just in case we had to leave in a hurry, and he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I began making my way towards the tent. I was totally keyed up, with my senses on full alert. When I got to the tent, there were several things that struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, and no wood was collected. The tent itself was literally full of backpacks, and I could also see women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave, intending on telling Nick what I had witnessed. As I was heading back, I heard Nick start yelling, "Hey, come on, we've got to get out of here now." Having no idea why he was shouting, I sprinted back to the truck. When I broke out of the tree line, I saw an old beat-up Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The Taurus was occupied by two men. A third person was laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from reaching the road, but Nick maneuvered around them and accelerated towards the entrance. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we got back to the highway without ever seeing the car again. I still don't know if the person who was lying on the back window was male or female. I called the state police, and they promised that they would send a trooper out to that area. However, I received a call the next day from the trooper stating that the campsite, the backpacks, and the women's clothing was all gone, though he could tell that people had been in that area. That strange orange table was still by the thick aspen grove. We have not returned to that area, nor do we intend to. I contacted the state police, and they assured me that a trooper would be dispatched to that area. But the next day, I received a call from the trooper who reported that everything, the campsite, backpacks, and women's clothing, was gone. Though he could tell that people had recently been there, the strange orange table was still standing near the dense aspen grove. We haven't returned since, and we don't intend to. There's always a reason to be afraid. This video has come to an end. What do you think of the story? Don't hesitate to share your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and until next time. This is Midnight Shadows, signing off.